Good evening and welcome to the Legion Cantina. In today's episode, we're going through the Fleet Trooper expansion for the Rebel faction in Star Wars Legion. So, fleets, they used to be Rebels' premier sort of close range fighting unit, but then Sleeper Cell kind of came in and stole that crown from them. They have something to offer in the core slot, but yeah, they aren't necessarily something you can be taking all the time. But yeah, we're going to go through their unit cards, strengths, weaknesses, how you can use them in game, and some list building tips as well. So, what makes fleet troopers interesting and what makes them kind of useful? As you can see here from their unit card, they're pretty standard rebel trooper fare. One health, one courage. They do surge to hit, which is nice, and they are surging white on defense. The key bit you can see there is their weapons are melee to range 2, and that is where the fleet troopers are going to be operating 99% of the time. Um, the other thing that they have to offer that the other Rebel Core options don't have access to is charge. This does mean that you can be playing the fleets sort of quite up close and personal, and especially with some of the upgrades you can take with them as well, that will enhance those abilities. So the range 2 and melee damage is pretty solid. Like it's not insane and it's not super consistent, but it can be a sort of real threat and maybe a bit of a deterrent to your opponent. Charge is great. Like you can sometimes think of it if you're using it to attack an opponent as a free action, because very often with fleets, in order to get that charge off, you're going to be doing the move charge from a fair distance, which given the way Legion is played now, there's sort of a lot more kind of up close scrapping over objectives. Having something that can present that sort of more up close, potentially higher ceiling damage than maybe the Rebel Troopers or the Rebel Veterans can offer is definitely something useful. They're not super expensive, 40 points for the basic unit, and yeah, like again, they're just different to Rebel Troopers. Like it depends what kind of list you're going for as to whether or not you're going to include any fleets. The scattergun, 2 red, PS1, 22 points, I believe, and it's melee and range 2, and surge hit. So, to all intents and purposes, it's adding 2 hits and PS1, which is pretty good if you're able to get it off. There is that question of how you're going to close that gap, and we'll come on to that in this later on. But if you can get that scattergun firing a couple of times a game, it can present some really good value. Surge hit is great. If they didn't surge hit, you would effectively lose a third of your hits because on that white dice you've got the crit, the hit, and the surge. So converting those is super valuable when the majority of your dice pool is going to be white die. And they are sort of more suited to, as I've said, kind of new Legion than old Legion in terms of where the fights are occurring, and especially when they got that charge, it does make them feel sort of a lot more useful. Weaknesses again, the rebel faction. I feel like I'm saying this every single time. Fragile with white saves, and they don't have any defensive tech, and that is really crushing for fleets. Like the rebel troopers get nimble, the veterans get low profile. Like they all have something to keep them alive. Even pikes have independent dodge, right? Like troops have nothing. The fleet troops have nothing, and that is going to make them a very attractive target for your opponent in the same way that Sleeper Cell is an attractive target as well. Like wanting to deal with that sort of closer range, higher ceiling threat is going to be very valuable. The dice pool's fine on average, but it lacks consistency because you really going to struggle to generate aims with fleets. And throwing a bunch of white dice, I mean, yes, those 2 red if you're taking the scattergun give you more consistency, but a bunch of white dice it could be up to 8, right? But the average is about 3. And it's not often you're going to completely blank, but it will happen sometimes. And yeah, getting those 3 hits on a charge attack is possibly not where you want to be in a sort of a close range fight. The other thing to say is because fleets are so much sort of reliant on being closer to your opponent, they are inherently going to get less attacks. And I think I'm going to talk about this more. I'm going to do a list building video at some point in the future, where I talk about, actually how many times a unit is going to be able to attack is really worth considering. Realistically, with fleets, even if you sort of wrap them in cotton wool, 1, maybe 2 attacks is all you're getting, and actually it then becomes like, is the scattergun worth it? Probably, but like they can also just get blown away in one shot from a decent range unit, given their lack of defensive tech. Um, Courage one is particularly crushing for fleet because very often you're going to be sort of living on the sort of fringes of the range, as it were. So there's potential for a sort of move into that charge attack if you're moving into melee, but also with that range two shot, again, you might just be right at the edge of that range three band, and then you do a speed two move in, and then you shoot. But you need both of those to be able to get the value off, and it does mean that their threat range is inherently a lot shorter. So yeah, that can be problematic. The standby nerf is pretty frustrating for fleets. They just waiting around a corner behind line of sight blocking um, was just a fairly common strategy with fleets, and especially when they had, oh, what was it? Can't remember. They got an aim whenever they went on standby. They won't be getting charge off outside of their activation with the new change to the way charge, relentless, and steady work. And the final point is they don't necessarily always fit with the normal rebel game plan. Like a lot of, perhaps in my opinion, what makes rebels good is that sort of skirmishing at slightly longer ranges with the rebel troopers and the dodgers and things like that. Rebels don't necessarily excel in the sort of up close and personal stuff. Like they don't have the sort of huge damage threats that Empire and Gar and CIS and all these units, these armies can offer. So yeah, it's an interesting one with fleets. Like they definitely have a niche, but it's just whether or not that niche is going to be useful to you. The upgrades you can take on with fleet. Firstly the heavy weapons. There's the MPL 57, which I never really understood why. Yeah, why? Firstly, why is this gun range 3? Um, and because if you're shooting just this gun, I guess maybe when you're moving in and they're not getting any cover, and you might get like a hit or two through, like. It's probably not the worst thing, but if you're spending 22 points on that over the scattergun, which crucially gives Pierce, yeah, I never really understood what that. I mean, yeah, I never really understood what the Barrage Trooper's doing. I mean, maybe if this didn't cycle, that could be quite interesting because then you might be more focused on taking like range two shots, removing cover with those large white dice pools. Maybe it'd be worth it, but yeah, it feels like a weird one. In contrast, I think the scattergun makes total sense of what the fleets are doing. Like this is taking what fleets are doing already and making it better. And in my opinion, that's why the scattergun is significantly better than the Barrage Trooper. Also, getting access to any level of Pierce in the current version of Legion is super valuable. Like Pierce is at a real premium right now, so being able to remove those red saves you're going to be running into a lot of the time is just very valuable. So yeah, I'm a big fan of the scattergun on fleets, and nearly always try and squeeze it in if I've got the points. Some more niche upgrades, but upgrades I do see people take. Big fleets, I think, are fun. I think it's bad, but I think it's fun. The Indomitable is extra valuable for fleets. Because as I said, they're really reliant on getting off their two actions to sort of close that distance with their reduced threat range. Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. I've never personally taken this because I don't think it's very good. But I mean, if you want to run big fleets with a scattergun and really scare some people, feel free to drop over 100 points on that. Medical droid. I've mentioned before. Sometimes I like to run a medic on fleet, just so they can charge in with the scattergun, dig a hero that doesn't want to be in melee out of melee by killing the unit that's tying them down, and then they can also, if that hero is taken a wound, drop a medic heal on them. Also, because I'll tend to be trying to hide my fleets behind line of sight blocking, they weirdly are sometimes more survivable just because I'm being so much more cautious with them rather than with token rebel troopers who might just catch a lucky shot from a tank at range, not lucky, but catch a big shot from a tank at range and then just roll poorly on the white defense die or whatever and just get blown away in one shot. So yeah, I think medic droid on fleets is sometimes quite nice, but a situational one, and you need the right units in your list. Some list building tips. Personally, for me, and I haven't seen many lists that take more than one fleet. I think two is probably the limit, because I just think there's kind of diminishing returns on having lots of units who are all up close and personal and are very vulnerable to being blown away in one turn. So yeah, I this one has two in, and I think this is quite interesting. I think in this list again, look, it's Lair and Wicket back again. But I think in a list like this, you would just have the sort of fleets supporting Bad Batch. You might even try and squeeze a medic in there if you could to get those medic heals on Bad Batch. And then yeah, it's double pathfinders, which I really like at the moment, and the truck. And you got sleep cell and the fleet to try and support Bad Batch and maybe act as a bit of a up close and personal deterrent. As I've already said, they're useful for digging other units out of melee, so Handler, Bad Batch, whatever. If there's a unit that's in melee doesn't want to be there, you can use the fleets almost sacrificially to dive in, try and kill the unit that's pinning them down, and then the fleets are probably going to die. But if they do that and enable, Bad Batch to get another useful action off or get in range of an objective, it's probably well worth it. One thing, this unit is really telegraphed in what it's going to be doing. Like, it's not like with, a Rebel Trooper unit, or even sometimes like with like IG in this list, for instance, or there are options you have with those units. They can plink at long range, but also they have maybe the option to move in a bit closer, with IG's command cards and things like that to do a bit of damage. But fleets are always going to be moving up close and hiding behind LOS blocking, and that's very easy to predict. And while it isn't necessarily that easy to counter, it does mean your opponent is going to have a very good understanding of where those fleets are going to be ending up. I will say for their points cost, they do draw quite a lot of attention. I think it's the charge that people don't like. People don't like the idea of their units that they don't want in melee being stuck in melee with some rubbish fleets, because actually sometimes units that aren't melee specialists will not be able to kill them in one hit. So then it becomes incredibly frustrating losing sort of key actions with a hero or a unit that doesn't want to be stuck in melee with some rubbish fleets that only cost 60 points. So yeah, they can be an irritation, and they will tend to draw sort of quite a lot of eyes to them in the same way that perhaps Sleeper Cell do. Speaking of Sleeper Cell, quick comparison here of the sort of expected wounds. So this is not hits, this is the wounds you would expect to do with the different setups of fleets versus white surging saves, red and red surging saves. And then I've also chucked in Sleeper Cell with the Astro at the bottom, just for some comparison. So yeah, it's the basic fleet unit. Its damage threshold is not very scary. As I said before, without aims, you can expect to hit 3 times with a basic fleet unit, which means realistically you're not going to do much. Even against another unit of fleets, a white surging unit, they're not very scary. So all I would see that basic unit of fleets for is just trying to tie something up that doesn't want to be tied up. And yeah, that's kind of it with the fleets. Nothing wrong if you need an activation filler, like them versus Rebel Troopers. Again, if you've got 2 units of Rebel Troopers already and you just want another activation that maybe does something a bit different, chucking fleets in is no bad thing. Moving up a tier, and this is, I think, shows the value of the Pierce. It should be noted, all of these units that they are effectively attacking aren't immune, Pierce, or impervious or anything. That table is way too big to fit on here, so these are just normal units with these saves. But yeah, fleets with a scattergun, they take a real jump up in damage. You can see basically compared to the sort of basic fleet unit, you can kind of expect your wounds to at least double, if not more, by adding the scattergun. So your expected wounds against white surging are 4, red is 3.3, and even against red surging you can expect 2.6. And that's again showing that value of the Pierce. Like, it just makes your dice pool, your damage so much more consistent. In comparison to Sleeper Cell, though, you can see where this unit struggles so much. So for an extra 13 points or an extra 8 points, if you don't want to bring the Astromech, although I think you should definitely bring the Astromech now, you can expect an extra 1.8 hits versus the 1.8 wounds versus the scattergun fleets, and you can expect an extra 1.1 versus the scattergun fleet against red saves. And against red surging, it's interesting because the value of that Pierce making your damage that much more consistent. Actually, I think maybe this is a niche where fleets can be quite interesting, is against those red. Is against me specifically. I'm thinking clones here, if I'm honest. Like a basic clone core unit who effectively are surging because of the way Gar works. But they don't have any immune pierce or any impervious, so it does just make them that bit more consistent. So yeah, I think fleets do have some value against high quality units without impervious or immune pierce. Also should be noted, one of my favourite uses of fleets is to kill droidicas. They are extremely useful because they don't have to worry about the shields, and all it takes is a little bit of a high roll. Like generally, if you can put, I think it's 7 hits through with the fleets, you're going to kill the droidicas on average, and it's not likely to happen, but it's also not that ridiculous. I think your average with the scattergun is around 5, so you just need a little bit of a high roll, and then suddenly you can just blow away what would otherwise be a really annoying unit. And that's where that charge is super valuable for just, again, engaging those units that don't want to be in melee. How would I use them in game? The overall comment is carefully. Treat them like you would a force user on the first turn of the game, but treat them like that all the time. Essentially, assume if they are left out in the open that they'll die. Unless someone is running a army that has no range 4 and range 3 options, if you leave them out in the open on any of the first 2 turns, even if they're in cover, they're probably just going to get shot to pieces. They're a really attractive target. They have no defensive tech, and even with heavy cover, you can't rely on them to sort of stay alive. So, behind line of sight blocking, um, generally what you want to think about is it's not just about the first turn, it's about how the fleets are going to cross the battlefield that is key. At the bare minimum, they always need to be in heavy cover. Ideally, they would be behind line of sight blocking. So here, what you would probably end up doing is probably dropping behind sort of the low quality pictures. I'm increasingly finding a bit of a pain, but you would drop them behind this sort of grey building on the left, and then what you probably do is you're realistically either going to end up behind the grey building in the bottom left, or the sort of one bang in the centre of the board by that objective there. And that would actually work fairly well because you just want to be as hidden as possible. And you just wait with fleets. Like, you don't necessarily have to get up there and be super aggressive. Like, if they can just lurk on a back objective, and even better if they can be in scoring range, that's not a bad use of them at all. And, if you do late game spy an opportunity to go and be aggressive and push up, that's a really useful thing. But I think don't be surprised if in the first 2 turns of the game it just feels like you're hiding and being a bit cowardly, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's always better to have that activation around for the late game where they can present a real threat to some units that are just clinging onto a back objective maybe. Fleets running in on the charge and blowing away a weak core unit late game is absolutely where I think a lot of value can come from fleets. So yeah, maybe think of them as sort of more of a long-term investment than getting that sort of short-term kick out. Maybe a sort of early game hopeful shot at a unit that probably won't actually kill them if they're in heavy cover. For close the pocket, again here you want to be thinking about where your opponent's sort of threats that they can realistically deal with are going to be. So, for instance, if they have, a tank, or if they have a force user, fleets can't really do a lot about that. Like, they can try, but they have no keywords and no abilities to help them deal with that. So again, just playing quite cautiously in the early game, making sure there is a route across the board that keeps you in heavy cover and keeps you behind line of sight blocking. And maybe again in that late game, when there are some weaker units hanging around, just running in and trying to get that value off that pierce and that charge. So yeah, in this case, just avoid the ATST would be my main advice. And again, like, while they do have charge, and they could maybe do a little bit of damage to Vader, like they might put like 4 or 5 hits in and like maybe do a wound or 2, he's then instantly going to kill them on his attack, because if you only have 5 in the unit, realistically Vader's lightsaber is going to kill them, and then he'll just move off. And yeah, maybe actually doing a wound or 2 to Vader and robbing him of an action is worth 60 points sometimes. So that can be a use of fleets, but I don't think that is the ideal usage for them. In terms of a tier list position, I think I personally value the Rebel Troopers over the fleets. I think there are occasions where I would take 3 Rebel Troopers in an army. I personally don't think I would ever take 3 fleets in an army. Again, like, if there is a list that suits them, I think definitely give it a go. And they are quite fun. Like, they have some real high roll potential, and there will be games where they feel great. But yeah, I think I wouldn't put fleets quite as high up as I've put Rebel Troopers. I don't think fleets are quite C tier because, again, while I think these are not the best units and they are going to end up being placed above some units that are inverted commas better, because you have to take some core, I think you have to view fleets and rebel troopers as sort of being almost a tier higher than they actually are. So, for instance, I think I said in the rebel trooper video, these guys are probably actually C tier, but I'm going to put them in B. In the same way with fleets, I think these guys are actually low C tier, but I'm going to put them in low B tier. I'm going to put them just below Ahsoka. I think, yeah, it's not so much a core tax anymore because the core units are not as bad as they used to be, but so much of the power, as I've said before, in Rebels is held in the operatives and the special forces. And as soon as you're rarely going to end up, at least for me, running more than 3 or 4 core units. So while you do have to take them once you kind of filled your quota, it's then rare to sort of keep adding more core in. So yeah, for that reason, I'm going to put them low B tier. Cool. Well, thank you for watching. I really enjoy fleets, and I think I very often will end up just dropping one into a list for just something different. To support Sleeper Cell or Bad Batch or something. Like I think they can be really valuable in their niche. So yeah, give them a go if you haven't already. Um, Apologies for the audio quality on this one. So I'm home for the holidays and I didn't bring my microphone with me, so just recording this off my laptop. Hope it sounds okay. Um, Next video, I think I'm planning to put out a list building video just talking about what kind of things I tend to do, the process I tend to go through when I'm building a list for the Rebels. Let me know what you think about fleets in the comments below, and I'll see you for the next one.